Welcome to Lecture 5A. We're going to talk about capacity management concepts. Henry Poincaré said, "It is far better to foresee, even without certainty, than not to foresee at all." And we have to foresee when it comes to capacity. And we'll see why in this discussion. So some of the objectives for this section is, one, to understand strategic capacity planning, including the trade-offs with cost and lost sales that happen when we have too much or too little capacity. We look at time horizons, which is basically when do we add or take off capacity, early, lead, lag, or matching. And we'll look at a concept of economies of scale, which many people are familiar with. We'll also talk about diseconomies of scale, so some of the trappings of larger scale that we need to be aware of as managers. We'll look at incremental investment and risk levels associated with common methods of adding capacity internally and externally, some of the different approaches we can take incrementally and how risk and cost goes along with those. We'll look at the pros and cons associated with those three different timing strategies on do we add capacity before we need it, when we need it, or after we need it, and talk about some of the repercussions of those. We will also look briefly at the theory of constraints and understand how constraints drive process capacity. So we're looking at macro levels of capacity at the plants, at building new plants, etc. We're also thinking about down into the process level. And let's do it. So here's a good definition. Capacity, the capability of a worker, a machine, a work center, an organization, a plant to produce output in a given time period. So usually we think about capacity as an output. Sometimes we think of it as an input, but generally we can say it's typically called an output. Capacity decisions that managers face: when to add or reduce capacity, where to add or reduce capacity, how much capacity to add or reduce by is a very important managerial decision because it often involves significant cost. How do we measure capacity, and what factors affect capacity, such as quality and many others? What is the impact of the supply chain on our capacity? Are they a limiting factor? So let's talk about strategic capacity planning. So the big picture, long-term stuff. Strategic capacity planning is an overall approach to determine the capacity level of capital-intensive resources. So the decisions that we take that are going to require a lot of money and that are going to be probably that we're going to need to live with for a fairly long period of time, such as facilities, equipment, significant hiring to the labor force. So we can think of capacity of an activity or a process in different areas, right? So here's 4 different activities that we could look at to give you an example. And we'll also look at some constraints that affect those activities. So the operations function, what are some of the constraints for that? Labor, how much labor do we have? Machinery, equipment, facilities, the size of the facilities, the number of the facilities, the location of the facilities. Transportation, how many trucks do we have or can we outsource to, the availability of those trucks? Containers, do we have special containers that are required to transport our product, and are they available in sufficient quantity? Do we have too many containers? Do we have excess capacity of containers? Inspection. So how many inspectors do we have? So you could say this about any activity. How many people do we have to do those, and how much personal equipment, such as gauges, do we have to perform that particular activity? Storage capacity. So storing, we need space, racks, and facilities, right? And depending on the quantity of those, it will drive our capacity of storage. Here's a fairly simple diagram, easy to understand, but it drives an important trade-off. So we can think about the cost and the benefits of lead and lag strategies, but start to see the cost side, the trade-off in costs of lost sales if we have insufficient capacity, and the cost of the excess capacity if we have too much. So this is why, for many reasons, firms usually have somewhere near the amount of capacity that'll match their sales. So somewhere near matching tends to be a common strategy. But if we're in an extremely lucrative business or launching new products that require some time for demand to come up, we could find ourselves with excess capacity deliberately. If we're in a declining market, we can see excess capacity that we need to shed because we won't need it again. We have it, but it's from past demand. And so we can think of different examples anyway where we could be at different places on this curve. There's the ideal location, and then there's reasons why a firm might be in different locations. It's important to remember that when we have situations with excess capacity, that'll tend to drive pricing wars. When firms have a lot of excess capacity, they want to utilize their capacity, and there will be a tendency towards lowering prices and lower returns. So industries don't want to carry a lot of excess capacity. We could think of the prices on oil in the world and how they've moved with different demand levels. As more capacity arises from different places on the planet, then we see sometimes prices fall. And we also might see restrictions in capacity to drive prices back up. So in many examples, if we have scarce capacity, less capacity than the market need, we'll see how mobile capital is and how the capital systems work, so that water, runs downhill just like water, really, money. And it'll flow to where demand is. And if we have restrictions in capacity at the industry level, we'll see good prices, usually demand higher than supply, and we'll see capital flow to raise the capacity of that particular product in that particular industry. So there's interesting repercussions at the firm level and at the industry level of thinking about this trade-offs in capacity. Here's just a simple diagram to talk about the planning time horizon. So we have these tactical, short-term, daily and weekly schedules, operational stuff, really not tactical, but operational. And we have tactical, intermediate, things that happen with monthly and quarterly plans and ways to deal with capacity by maybe bringing on a little bit more temporary labor or outsourcing some work in a short term to a service provider, a contract house, and so forth. And then we have the long-term strategic capacity, so building equipment and facilities and so forth, and making long-term commitments. So we have this concept of economies of scale that we usually learn in an economics course, where we think that bigger can provide many benefits. So greater volumes usually bring along with it some advantages where we can take our overhead and spread it across those volumes. We have more specialization, so we can become very good at things that we do in high numbers. We can apply technology. We can bring advanced systems and methods of production. So we get real good at things we do well through specialization. We have opportunities to fully utilize resources when we have high volumes. And we can become dependent, though, on those things, as we'll see in some of the diseconomies. Lower costs because we can buy in larger volumes from our suppliers, and more chance for learning. So we have these learning curves, right, that occur. Some are fast, where it might take 3 to 5 days for somebody to reach a very experienced level of a job, a very high quality, good output level of a job. And some are long, where it might take 6 months, a year, longer to become really good at a job, depending on the skills that are required. It can be easier to hide problems, which can be a good thing, let's say, in some ways, because we might not have to suffer a consequence of a problem when we have economies of scale. But it's still a problem, right? So it's not necessarily desirable. So when is bigger not better? When do we have diseconomies of scale? Well, when we become have these investments in big capacities, we become dependent on those. So we require high volumes. We become volume dependent, is what we say. So we require consistent high demand. If we have a plant set up to build a particular item, let's say a glass plant, it's a huge capital investment and it needs to run. And so we have to have demand for that glass. It can be complex. So many times when we set up systems to run at very high volumes, they become complicated, capital intensive, expensive, and complicated. We can have a bureaucracy. It can become hard to make decisions as we grow larger. The status quo takes over, and sometimes there's very developed decision-making processes that might stifle us, where a smaller organization might be more nimble. So, if you're in a small operation, sometimes employees or the owner, the operator is right there on staff, and you can make a decision instantly that a large organization might take days, weeks, or even months. Communication is easier in a smaller business, so we can have diseconomies of scale with communications, and we can have inertia take over, where the way we do things is the way we keep doing things, and people feel less able sometimes to have continuous improvement and to affect the way things are done, and inertia can take over. And we can have a loss of focus. So when we're really big, sometimes the complication factor takes over, and we may not be, as we said on the other side, able to specialize and have advantages of specialization. Sometimes a loss of focus can counterbalance that. And it's easier to hide problems can be a problem as well, right? It's put in red at the bottom of both because it may seem like a benefit sometimes, but generally we can say hiding problems is not a good thing. So some different alternatives. So if we wanted to add capacity, we might look at internal sources, and we could look at, let's say, these 4 typical ways of adding capacity internally: increasing the efficiency of a particular process, having more efficiency out of it, hitting our standards, increasing the flexibility of a process. So saying we can take this capacity and basically run 2 different processes through this piece of our capacity, this assembly line, or we could cross-train our employees and so forth. So adding flexibility to what we do increases capacity in many cases internally. Facilities expansion, addition, so let's blow that wall out and take advantage of more of our real estate and add some capacity, put in another assembly line or whatever it might be. Or we could add facilities. So in each one of these steps, the point of their order is that we're going from low investment and risk to high investment and risk, right? So there are ways to incrementally work on capacity internally, and then there are areas of working internally that require more investment, more time, and higher risks. Conversely, or alternatively rather, we can look at capacity alternatives that are external to the company. And here's a short list of some of those options. So we could outsource. We could just take, we can go down to the smallest level we want. We could take a little piece of an assembly line and outsource that. We could send the work to a supplier long term. We could outsource it to a contract house for a short-term boost in capacity, or we could outsource an entire assembly process outside. Right? We can also insource, which in this case means not bringing something we did outside into our business. It's not the opposite of outsourcing. It requires an explanation. Insourcing means bringing outside suppliers and sourcing their activities and support into our operation. So we could bring in workers or equipment from outside the company, and instead of outsourcing it, take an incremental step of saying, we want you to do that work at our facilities. That's insourcing. They become more embedded into our operation by insourcing. So it is an incremental step higher on this continuum. Sharing capacity. We can share capacity with different companies. You see an example in airlines, for example, when you buy a seat. Sometimes you'll notice it might be commented in the ticketing function or on our ticket, or when we get to the airport, we'll notice, hey, I bought this from one airline, but I'm going to the gate and getting on an airplane of another airline. So they can share routes and share assets and sometimes help each other, fulfill the capacity of their airplane for that particular route. Joint ventures are another step incrementally up the scale on the external sources of capacity. And it's very important in joint ventures to know what we're doing because they last an average of 7 years. Usually it starts with obvious mutual advantage between two organizations to work together. And it looks lucrative enough and long-term enough that they say, let's form a joint venture. Let's do this together. And for companies that are really good at managing joint ventures, they know that the passion of the romance will wane and reality will set in. And at some point, the joint venture won't make as much sense as it did when they first got together. So it's important to see the end of the joint venture at the beginning of the joint venture so that when things separate at some point and one partner buys out the other or it's dissolved for whatever reason, that you're not left with a negative value. Maybe lost access to a market, for example, or lost technology, and try to negotiate those things and get them into the contract up front. Acquisitions are a more expensive way and a higher risk way, really, of adding capacity, and that's because we're not going to form a joint venture. We're going to buy a firm. All right, we're gonna get into this technology or this area of the country or the world through an acquisition. We're gonna buy it. It's part of the house. Okay, so those are again incrementally more investment and risk as we go up the scale. Capacity flexibility is worth talking about because there's a number of ways that we can use flexibility as a midterm way of dealing with capacity. And firms that are good at this get some really nice benefits from it. So we can make our plants more flexible. A nice example of that is a circus tent. Picture large open space that is reconfigurable and that can work in a variety of different ways. We could also think about the flexibility that Dell has to just simply assemble different processes on their line, right? Plug and play, we can make what we want to make. Or the Poletown plant at General Motors, a very flexible automotive plant. Some say the most flexible in the world. And so we can be flexible in our processes. Another way to be flexible, or in our plants rather, another way is to be flexible in the process. So simpler equipment that's easy to set up, quick changeovers allows us to run probably in batch. If you think of the different assembly line type processes, the different ways to approach production processes, the different layouts. So batch is a good one to think of when we think about flexible processes that are simple to set up, and we can run batches for one customer and then run batches for another. Or again, we could use those processes like Dell would use. Flexible workers are another way. So many plants will take their labor force and will basically say, we're going to cross-train people on X number of jobs, so that as work for one customer goes up and another goes down and demand rises and falls across all of our spectrum of different things that we manufacture and sell, or services can be the same way, that our personnel are able to move from job to job. We don't have to hire and train people to absorb changes in demand. We can simply redeploy at different days of the week, different hours of the day, different months of the year, and so forth. Here is a graph from our textbook that basically shows by different organization types that we can have different capacity measures and different factors affecting capacity. So capacity could be described as an input, usually an output, but it also could be an input. And this first example is an interesting one to think of the inputs. So a law firm The capacity is billable hours available each month, right? But what drives that? It's the number of attorneys, it's the inputs, the paralegals and lawyers that we have on our staff. So in that case, inputs are driving capacity to a large extent. And we might think of capacity as how many lawyers we have. Do we have time to take on this case? Well, let me think. Out of our 20 lawyers, I think those 2 are available that month. And yes, so we do have capacity because we have lawyers that are available. A textile spinning plant, it could be the spinning hours per shift, the number of spindles that we can produce in a week, and the factors affecting it: number of machines running, quality of the materials, so quality driving our productivity, and maintenance. How much maintenance do we need to do? An automatic car wash. How many cars can we do per hour? How many cars can we wash in an hour? And factors affecting it: the availability of the water and chemicals, the reliability of the car wash itself. Does it need to go down for maintenance from time to time? Does it stay up and running generally when it should be up and running? Airlines, seats times miles flown could be a measure of capacity. What drives it: the number of jets, pilots, and terminals. So depending on the industry, you might have different measures of capacity and different factors affecting capacity. Here's a summary slide showing some examples of many factors that affect capacity, and assumptions have to be made often to estimate how much capacity we have available. So the number of lines used and their availability, the number of shifts operating, and should we change the number of shifts, the number of temporary workers used. So should we add temps, reduce temps? Do we have the right number of temps? The number of storage facilities. So how much opportunity do we have to overflow? If we have excess inventory, are there opportunities to temporarily store capacity as inventory? The product variations on the lines, which tends to reduce capacity. How much variation are we going to have? Are we going to add variation to the line and thus reduce our capacity? Conformance quality. So poor quality tends to reduce capacity because our people are working on these quality issues, right? Instead of doing what we wanted them to be working on. And the converse is true. When we improve quality, capacity tends to increase because people can be productive and not be fighting quality problems. Here are the 3 common capacity timing strategies. So lead, lag, or match. So should we add capacity and lead demand? So add capacity before the demand is anticipated. So be ahead of it. Have excess capacity for some time period. Should we lag capacity? So are we more conservative about this? If it's really expensive capacity and we're not really confident about how much demand is going to come and when it's going to come, we may lag it. We may say, no, we're going to have cost of lost sales. And when we really know we've got this demand, we'll take the moves and add some capacity on. And of course, those can be to different levels, right? It's not a formula. It's saying I'm going to be more aggressive or more conservative in when I add capacity. A matching strategy would simply be saying I'm not going to have much lead or lag. I'm going to try to add capacity when I think the demand is going to materialize. And so, virtually every addition of adding capacity is somewhere in the lead lag. The question is, how close do we get to matching? How close do we try to get to matching? Here's a little diagram to simply put a picture worth 1,000 words. So here's the lead strategy: deliberately, incrementally adding capacity ahead of demand. Never saying no to a customer order, but carrying this excess capacity cost. Here on the other end of it is waiting until demand is really proven, the green line being demand, and here we're adding capacity way after demand is proven, very conservative, and incurring that cost of lost sales. All these lost sales in between the 2 lines. And then, of course, what many firms would do would be this bouncing around across the line, right? Depending on what your relationship is with your customers, how much you must have capacity available before demand, and by contractual basis of your customer not taking any risk of lack of capacity, you may have to lead capacity to some extent. And then the relationship of the cost of the capacity and the certainty of demand, right? So there's different reasons that firms take different approaches here, and it's not a right or wrong answer. It's just part of the strategy. So the theory of constraints, we're gonna talk about in another section in much more detail, but it is helpful to think about the theory of constraints when we think about capacity, because the process aspect of capacity is definitely impacted by the theory of constraints. So here's a nice definition from the book: an approach to visualizing and managing capacity which recognizes that nearly all products and services are created through a series of linked processes, and in every case there is at least one process step that limits throughput for the entire chain. This is, if it's a line, driving your cycle time of the line; if it is a process, driving your throughput for the entire chain. So the main point that if this is your constraint, C, the smallest pipe, the smallest spot in this process is going to drive the speed for the entire process. That's the simple way to understand the point of how TOC, the theory of constraints, has effect on process capacity. In this simple example, we're looking at parts per hour. So 50 parts, 70 parts per hour, 40 parts per hour, 90 parts per hour. Clearly, process 3, with a capacity of 40 parts per hour, is limiting the entire process throughput to 40 parts per hour. The steps of the theory of constraints are very simple, helpful to understand. You identify the constraint, you exploit the constraint by basically managing it in the near term as advantageously as you can. For example, never starving the constraint, making sure it runs as well as possible. And then you subordinate all the other steps to that constraint. In the prior example, that would mean we run all of the steps of the process at 40 parts per hour. We don't overrun where we have excess capacity. We run at the speed of the constraint. We subordinate all other steps to the constraint. And then we elevate the constraint, or break the constraint, it's sometimes called, meaning we could add capacity to that step 3 of that process. We would add capacity here by buying more equipment, by becoming more efficient, by training our people, by improving quality, by doing all the things that we can do in the business at the process level to improve this. We would raise it up so that it is no longer the constraint. Okay, so raise it, and then we would find the new constraint and repeat those steps. So it's related to continuous improvement in many ways because we keep going. When we've broken one constraint, there's a new one. It's helpful maybe to also talk for a moment about service capacity. So services are unique in some ways that are important to understand, because we have so many jobs and services. I'll try to bring this up as we go through the different modules. So service, it's important to remember that unlike goods, services cannot be stored for later use, meaning we don't have inventory buffers that we can balance out supply and demand, right? So it means the capacity has to be available when at the time of demand. We're not able to store it. Another is the location. So because we cannot store it, it means that the capacity has to be located at the place of demand as well. We also have a third aspect. In many services, demand is very volatile. We might have very stable production of goods and services and leveled production and stability across a system of supply for goods and services. Many times services will fluctuate seasonally and just daily, hourly. We can have big fluctuations in the demand. So if you combine all of these, there's more pressure on services in how they can manage their capacity. So some of those tools, such as cross-training employees and so forth, and outsourcing some work, strategic relationships between similar service capacity providers become very important in managing capacity. The methods to evaluate different capacity alternatives, we'll look at in another section some of the calculations related to these, but we need to think about cost of adding capacity, think about the demand and the certainty of demand, the different demand scenarios that might materialize. We can look at expected value if we think of the probability of different demand scenarios and think of the cost and the probability of different levels of demand. We can find expected value. Through decision trees, we can map out basically some different scenarios, add the calculations, and visually see what might be a very complex environment we might be able to simplify through some graphical tools such as decision trees, and we can do break-even analysis. So we may look at a different way of adding capacity and just say, if we do this, what's the break-even? When do we get our money back? At what point does it stop being a loss and start turning profitable again if we think about quantities? So in summary of this section, the strategic capacity involves long-term commitments, high expense. There's a trade-off between the capacity and the cost through the cost of lost sales and the cost of excess capacity. There are incremental ways to increase capacity internally and externally, and those have different increasing risks and costs as we move up the scale on those. It's important to understand economies of scale, but also as a manager to understand diseconomies of scale. So we get all these benefits as we add and increase volumes and have a larger footprint of capacity, but we also have some pitfalls, some diseconomies that we need to be aware of so we can manage them. Capacity timing can lead, lag, or match demand, and that depends on the situation, right? There's not a right or wrong answer to leading or lagging or matching. Sometimes contractually, we have to carry excess capacity so that we never are a limiting factor for our customers. And the theory of constraints is useful to understand process capacity, how bottlenecks limit process capacity. Finally, service capacity has some unique attributes that are important to understand. We cannot store that capacity. It's intangible, so we can't put it into storage. It means we have to be at the time of demand, we have to have the capacity available. At the location of demand, we have to have the capacity available. And the demand is sometimes more volatile for services. So the ability to move capacity up and down through the various tools that we have at hand are sometimes very important for services. That concludes our discussion on capacity. I hope you enjoyed it. And in another section, we'll look at some of the calculations that help us to make sense of some of the decisions that we need to make as managers on when and how much to add capacity.